Biblical truth on divorce, separation, and remarriage. God's standards revealed. A biblical perspective from Matthew 5:31-32. Please listen to this message to the end. Don't judge, and if you have anything to say, please write it in the comments section. If you are blessed by the message, also comment in the comments section and share it for others to benefit. God bless you. In Matthew 5:31-32, Jesus addresses the issue of divorce, saying, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Matthew 5:31-32, NIV. These words reveal God's original intent for marriage, permanence and faithfulness. Divorce was never part of God's perfect design. Rather, it was permitted because of human hardness of heart. Matthew 19:8. To better understand this, let's examine two foundational biblical marriages, Adam and Eve and Abraham and Sarah. Adam and Eve, the first marriage and its trials. Adam and Eve's marriage was the first union instituted by God. Genesis 2:22-24. They were created to be one flesh, reflecting God's divine plan for marriage. However, their relationship faced a severe test when Eve was deceived by the serpent and ate the forbidden fruit. She then gave the fruit to Adam, leading to humanity's fall into sin. Genesis 3:6. At this moment, Adam could have blamed Eve and abandoned her, arguing that she led him into sin. Yet, despite the grave consequences, including pain, toil, and eventual death, there was no mention of divorce. Instead, Adam continued with Eve, and together they bore children. Genesis 4:1-2. This demonstrates the principle of enduring commitment even in the face of great failure. God himself upheld their union by covering them with garments, Genesis 3:21, symbolizing his mercy and the covering of their sins. Their marriage, though wounded by sin, remained intact. This sets a precedent. Marriage is meant to endure, even through trials and failures. Abraham and Sarah, a marriage tested but not broken. Abraham and Sarah also faced many challenges, yet they remained together. Sarah's barrenness and Hagar's involvement. Sarah was unable to conceive, and in her desperation, she gave Hagar, her maidservant, to Abraham as a surrogate wife. Genesis 16:1-3. This decision brought strife into their marriage as Hagar despised Sarah after conceiving. Genesis 16:4. Despite this, Abraham did not abandon Sarah or seek to replace her. Sarah's doubt and laughter. When God promised them a son in their old age, Sarah laughed in disbelief. Genesis 18:12. Yet her doubt did not make Abraham walk away from the marriage. He continued to trust in God's promise, and eventually Isaac was born. Genesis 21:1-3. Abraham's deception about Sarah twice. Abraham lied about Sarah being his sister to protect himself. Genesis 12:10-20, Genesis 21-18. These actions put Sarah at great risk, yet she remained with him. Despite his flaws, Abraham was still faithful to Sarah, and she remained his only wife until her death. Genesis 23:1-2. Throughout their journey, Abraham and Sarah had every reason for separation. Infertility, deception, and external pressures, but they stayed together, showing the endurance of a God-centered marriage. Jesus' standard for marriage. Jesus' words in Matthew 5:31-32 reaffirm God's intention for marriage. While divorce was permitted under Mosaic law, Deuteronomy 24:1-4, Jesus clarified that this was not God's original plan. The only permissible reason for divorce is sexual immorality. This teaches that marriage is a sacred covenant meant to withstand trials, misunderstandings, and hardships. Conclusion. The call to endurance in marriage. From Adam and Eve to Abraham and Sarah, we see marriages that face trials but did not end in divorce. These examples teach us that marriage requires commitment, forgiveness, and reliance on God's grace. Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5:31-32 reminds us that marriage is not to be taken lightly and that God's design is for unity, not separation. Rather than looking for an escape, couples should seek God's help to navigate difficulties. As seen in the lives of Adam and Eve and Abraham and Sarah, God's plan is for marriage to endure, reflecting his faithfulness and love for his people. God's standards for separation, a biblical perspective from 1 Corinthians 7. Marriage is a sacred covenant designed by God, meant to reflect his love, commitment, and faithfulness. However, relationships often face challenges, and some may question whether separation is ever acceptable in the eyes of God. In 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul provides divine wisdom on marriage, separation, and the circumstances under which believers may or may not part ways. God's desire for marital unity. Paul begins by affirming God's original intent for marriage, permanence, and mutual commitment. To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. 1 Corinthians 7:10-11 NIV. Here Paul upholds Jesus' teaching that marriage is meant to be lifelong, Matthew 19:6. He makes it clear that separation should not be taken lightly. However, if separation does occur, the two options are reconciliation or remaining unmarried. This emphasizes God's standard. Marriage should not be dissolved for trivial reasons. Separation in cases of an unbelieving spouse. One of the key issues Paul addresses is the situation where a believer is married to an unbeliever. He encourages believers to remain in the marriage if the unbelieving spouse is willing to stay. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. 1 Corinthians 7:12-13 NIV. Why? Because the believing spouse has a sanctifying effect on the unbelieving spouse and children. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 14. This shows God's heart. He desires that Christian spouses be a light, potentially leading their unbelieving partners to Christ. However, Paul also provides an exception. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. 1 Corinthians 7:15 NIV. If an unbelieving spouse chooses to walk away, the believer is not held accountable for the separation. This implies that God values peace over forcing someone to remain in a marriage where the unbelieving spouse has already departed emotionally or physically. Separation for the purpose of devotion to God. Paul introduces another unique case, temporary separation for spiritual devotion. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. 1 Corinthians 7:5 NIV. This suggests that a husband and wife may agree to a temporary period of separation for fasting, prayer, or deepening their relationship with God. However, Paul warns that this should be temporary to avoid unnecessary temptation. This type of separation is not about breaking the marriage, but strengthening it through spiritual discipline. Separation. Due to extreme circumstances. While 1 Corinthians 7 does not explicitly mention abuse, neglect, or endangerment, biblical principles suggest that God does not expect anyone to remain in a situation that threatens their well-being. The Bible calls husbands to love their wives as Christ loves the church. Ephesians 5:25. And warns against mistreatment. Colossians 3 verse 19. If a spouse is in danger, whether physically, emotionally, or mentally, separation may be necessary for safety. However, as 1 Corinthians 7:11 states, separation should not automatically lead to remarriage, but should leave room for repentance, healing, and possible reconciliation if it aligns with God's will. God's ultimate standard, peace and holiness. Paul closes this section by reminding believers of the bigger picture. Each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. 1 Corinthians 17 NIV. God's standard for separation is not about personal preference, but about walking in His calling, peace, and holiness. Whether remaining in marriage or facing separation, believers are called to honor God, seek peace, and trust His guidance. Conclusion. Walking in God's wisdom. 1 Corinthians 7 provides a balanced, God-centered view of separation. Marriage is sacred and should not be broken lightly. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 10-11. If married to an unbeliever, stay unless they choose to leave. 1 Corinthians 7:12-15. Separation for spiritual devotion should be temporary and by agreement. 1 Corinthians 7:5. Separation for safety and well-being is sometimes necessary, though reconciliation should always be considered where possible. Above all, Believers must seek God's wisdom and peace in every marital situation. 1 Corinthians 7:17. While God's ultimate desire is for marriages to reflect His love and commitment, He also calls His people to live in peace, holiness, and wisdom. Separation should never be an easy decision, but when it is necessary, it must be approached prayerfully with God's guidance and in alignment with His will. Biblical standard for remarriage. When is it permissible? Remarriage is a sensitive topic in Christian doctrine, and the Bible provides clear guidance on when it is allowed. One key consideration is whether the original marriage was truly ordained by God. Additionally, 1 Corinthians 7:15 states that if an unbelieving spouse leaves, the believer is not under bondage. But does this mean they are free to remarry? Let's explore this topic with biblical references. When marriage is not ordained by God, some marriages are entered into outside of God's will. This could be due to ignorance, personal desires, or cultural pressures, rather than divine guidance. The Bible warns against being unequally yoked with unbelievers. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? 2 Corinthians 6:14 NIV. If a believer enters a marriage without seeking God's guidance, especially with someone who does not share their faith, it can lead to struggles. While God hates divorce, Malachi 2:16, there are cases where separation becomes inevitable. The case of the unbeliever who leaves Paul directly addresses the issue of an unbelieving spouse choosing to leave. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. God has called us to peace. 1 Corinthians 7:15 NKJV. Here, Paul teaches that if an unbelieving spouse abandons a believer, the believer is not under bondage. The phrase "not under bondage" suggests freedom, meaning the believer is no longer obligated to remain in that marital bond. Since marriage is a covenant, if one party breaks it and departs permanently, the covenant is effectively dissolved. Does "not under bondage" mean free to remarry? Many Bible scholars interpret "not under bondage" to mean that the believer is released from the marriage and is free to remarry. The logic is that if God has called someone to peace, they should not be forced to live in unnecessary bondage. Furthermore, in the Old Testament, when a marriage covenant was broken, e.g., through divorce or abandonment, remarriage was permitted. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. Deuteronomy 24:2 NKJV. This passage shows that once a person is legally and spiritually released from a marriage, remarriage is permitted. Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage. Jesus taught that remarriage is generally not permissible, except in cases of sexual immorality. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Matthew 19:9 NKJV. Here, Jesus clarifies that if a marriage ends due to sexual immorality, fornication, adultery, the innocent party is free to remarry. By extension, if an unbeliever departs, abandoning the marriage, the believer may also be free to remarry. The example of Abigail and David. A biblical example of a woman released from an ungodly marriage is Abigail. She was married to Nabal, a wicked and foolish man, 1 Samuel 25:3. Nabal dishonored God and mistreated Abigail. When God struck Nabal dead, Abigail was free to remarry, and David took her as his wife, 1 Samuel 25:39-42. Though Abigail's situation was unique, it illustrates the principle that when a marriage is dissolved outside of one's control through abandonment or death, remarriage is possible. Paul's encouragement to the widowed and free. Paul affirms that if a person is no longer bound to their previous marriage, they are free to remarry, but only in the Lord. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7:39 ESV. While this verse speaks specifically of widows, the principle applies to anyone whose marriage covenant has been broken lawfully. If an unbeliever departs, or the marriage was never truly God-ordained, remarriage should be pursued only with a believer, in alignment with God's will. Conclusion. When is remarriage permissible? Based on biblical teachings, remarriage is permissible in the following cases. If the original marriage was not ordained by God, e.g., entered into without seeking His will or with an unbeliever. If the unbelieving spouse abandons the marriage, 1 Corinthians 7:15. If the previous spouse was guilty of sexual immorality, Matthew 19:9. If the spouse has died, 1 Corinthians 7:39. In all cases, remarriage should be approached prayerfully and only in the Lord, 1 Corinthians 7:39, ensuring that the new union aligns with God's purpose. Marriage is sacred, and while God allows for remarriage in specific situations, His ultimate desire is for faithfulness, peace, and a relationship that honors Him. If this message has blessed you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to support the message, share it with others who need to hear God's truth, and subscribe for more powerful biblical insights. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Let's spread God's word together. God bless you.